All eyes are on the meeting between President Trump and Xi Jinping in China. What we're going to do in this video is talk about some of the implications for the Iran situation. But in order to frame that properly, let's take a look at what the big story coming out of the meeting so far is. And the big story is what Xi Jinping, what the Chinese side said, was said about Taiwan in the meeting. Now, conspicuously, the White House did not say anything about how Taiwan was discussed, but this is the big story that everyone's talking about today. Taiwan emerges as flashpoint in Trump-Xi talks. A Chinese summary of the meeting stressed the self-ruling island was the most important issue in bilateral relations between Washington and Beijing. The sensitive issue of Taiwan intruded Thursday on a high-stakes meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping in Beijing. Chinese officials, in a statement released after the lengthy sit-down, said that Xi stressed to President Trump that the Taiwan question is the most important issue in U.S.-China relations. U.S. allies were worried that Trump could end up disavowing U.S. support for Taiwan, perhaps even inadvertently in his summit with Xi. U.S. policy on Taiwan has long been to acknowledge Taiwan as distinct from the People's Republic of China, which claims the island as its territory. The island's semiconductor industry is critical to the Trump administration's efforts to create a secure supply chain for the U.S. technology sector. Quote, "If it is handled properly, the bilateral relationship will enjoy overall stability. Otherwise, the two countries will have clashes and even conflicts, putting the entire relationship in great jeopardy." Now, that is about as aggressive a statement as we've ever seen out of the Chinese about Taiwan. It really is properly interpreted by the pundits today who are talking about it as an actual warning from Xi Jinping, shaking a finger at Trump. Don't you dare on Taiwan. Don't and that it is incompatible to have Taiwanese independence, that Taiwanese independence and peace are incompatible concepts. That's what Xi Jinping said there. Now, what does this all have to do with Iran? Well, it has a lot to do with Iran, because one of the thoughts about America showing a show of force in Iran is that it would deter China from making a move on Taiwan, from being aggressive on Taiwan, because they would be afraid that America would use military force. But things have kind of changed. Things have changed because what's become very clear is that Trump does not want more kinetic action. The kinetic activity in the Iran situation was itself enough to spike oil prices and cause all sorts of domestic issues and international issues for Trump. He wanted to tamp down and tamp down the kinetic activity to get control of oil prices and start working on a diplomatic solution. And that's what he's been extending the ceasefire for this whole time. And I think that Xi Jinping sees Trump in a vulnerable position here, where he can be aggressive on the Taiwan issue, because the last thing that Trump needs for his legacy, for his presidency, for the price of oil, for everything else, is another flare-up in a different arena. So this is a real opportunity for Xi Jinping to be aggressive on this point, while also offering a hand of assistance to help with the Iran issue. Let's take a look at these other headlines I have for you here. Because with all of with everyone talking all nicely, we can't ignore this headline: U.S. issues new sanctions over Iran's shipments to China. Okay, and this is the U.S. had issued. This article here is behind a paywall. Let's pull up another one. I was reading another article here. Here we go. Beijing pushes back as U.S. sanctions Chinese oil refinery over Iran links. The U.S. has brought in more sanctions on China. Here. Chinese oil refineries funding Iran. Right? Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent recently accused China of helping to fund Iran's terror networks. Right? And the U.S. issued, here it is, new sanctions on Iran's oil shipments to China as part of economic fury. This is just from a couple of days ago. This is the Reuters piece. The U.S. government on Monday announced sanctions against 3 people and 9 companies including 4 based in Hong Kong and 4 in the United Arab Emirates, for aiding Iran's shipment of oil to China. Think of when this happened. The Trump-Xi meeting is happening today. Trump got there yesterday. Couple days before that, the Trump administration puts more sanctions on Iran for helping, on China for helping the Iranian oil industry. Think about that. Think about the timing. It's obviously leading into this. So for all of the niceties and Trump and Xi talking about how they're friends, what do you see here? That behind closed doors, Xi Jinping is getting very aggressive on the Taiwan issue, and this comes in the wake of the United States putting fresh sanctions on Chinese companies for dealing, for helping Iran make oil shipments. Okay, so they have new sanctions. And there were also sanctions. This one's from a couple weeks ago. Beijing pushes back as U.S. sanctions Chinese oil refinery. So throughout the last few weeks, the United States has been putting more and more sanctions on Chinese assets that are participating in the Iranian oil industry, because they see that the Chinese are helping the Iranians circumvent the sanctions and still get oil from them and still get money to them. And look at this escalation. China orders firms to ignore U.S.-Iran sanctions, daring U.S. to enforce crackdown. Expert calls the move a measure of defiance by Beijing as Trump administration intensifies pressure on Tehran's oil revenue. Look at this. China has ordered companies to disregard U.S. sanctions for targeting Iranian oil, forcing a direct test of Washington's ability to enforce its crackdown on Iran. A new directive issued through China's Commerce Ministry invokes a 2021 blocking statute that prohibits firms from complying with foreign sanctions deemed illegitimate. The order applies to several Chinese refiners accused by the United States of purchasing Iranian crude, including major independent processors known as teapot refineries. This is unprecedented. It's a major escalation in terms of China's response to U.S. economic statecraft. It's a measure of defiance by Beijing, said Max Meislich, a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. The escalation comes as the Trump administration intensifies its sanctions campaign targeting Chinese refiners and warning financial institutions they could face penalties for facilitating oil transactions between Iran and China. Okay, so this is pretty intense. So we're seeing all these nice, friendly pictures of Trump and Xi, and Trump's talking about what Xi's his friend. But meanwhile, China's warning Trump about Taiwan. Trump administration is intensifying sanctions on the Chinese use of the Iranian oil industry. And this brings us to one of our favorite games that we play on this channel, which is let's take a look at how the Iranian media is dealing with this. So Iranian state media, on WANA, there's an article from yesterday about the Trump-Xi visit, China, Trump, and the Hormuz Challenge. U.S. President Donald Trump's visit to Beijing comes at a time when the recent war against Iran and its impact on global energy security have added a new dimension to the strategic rivalry between Washington and Beijing. Analysts believe the crisis could overshadow the main objectives of the trip and turn the Strait of Hormuz into a key topic between the two powers. Since returning to the White House, Trump has intensified economic pressure on China through tariffs, trade restrictions, and measures targeting Chinese technology companies. It doesn't mention the sanctions because it doesn't want to say that publicly. The strategy is widely viewed as part of Washington's broader effort to contain China's growing economic influence. Although Beijing responded with retaliatory measures and the two sides are currently in a form of tariff truce, economic competition remains one of the central points of contention between the world's two largest economies. And it talks about how Taiwan is a red line. And it says, this is in advance of today's meeting, reports suggest that China may use the meeting with Trump to push for changes in Washington's official language on Taiwan, seeking a shift from not supporting Taiwan independence, that's the current policy, to opposing Taiwan independence openly. Reports suggest, now remember, this is Iranian state media. The Iranians are working in cahoots with the Chinese, and they put this in this article, buried in the middle of this piece, that Xi Jinping was going to pressure Trump on Taiwan, which he did. Now it talks about the strain on the global energy markets. The biggest shadow over his visit is the conflict with Iran. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the disruptions in Gulf energy shipments have placed heavy pressure on the global economy. China, as one of the world's largest oil importers, has been particularly vulnerable to the crisis. Beijing, which has major economic interests in the Persian Gulf region, views prolonged instability in the Strait of Hormuz as a direct threat to its energy security. Jump down. In recent weeks, the United States imposed a new package of sanctions on several major Chinese oil refining and trading companies. Washington said the move was aimed at limiting Iran's financial resources, but in practice, it targeted a critical part of China's energy supply chain. In response, Beijing issued a rare directive instructing Chinese companies listed under U.S. sanctions not to comply with American restrictions on Iran. This is huge, by the way. China openly making an announcement telling companies not to comply with U.S. sanctions is a very aggressive move. The warning about Taiwan is a very aggressive move. Observers see the move as a sign that China is entering a phase of active resistance against U.S. pressure. Remember, this is the state media of the Chinese partner. At the same time, the United States and Bahrain have reportedly drafted a resolution concerning the Straits of Hormuz aimed at increasing pressure on Iran. Speculation is now growing over whether China could veto the proposed resolution. Some analysts believe Trump may try during his Beijing visit to persuade China not to use its veto power, a matter that could become one of the most important behind-the-scenes issues in the negotiations. Nevertheless, the scale of strategic disputes between Washington and Beijing, from tariffs and Taiwan to the energy crisis, appears too extensive for this brief visit to produce any major lasting breakthrough between the two sides. In other words, tensions are rising between the two sides. And finally, on Tasnim, the other Iranian state media, the IRGC media, look at this headline. This is a headline from today, from a few hours ago. Chinese vessels begin transiting Strait of Hormuz with Iranian permission. Now, whether this is true or not is not even relevant. On the day of the Trump visit with Xi Jinping, with all this going on, look at this headline. With the decision made by the Islamic Republic, the passage of a number of Chinese vessels through the Strait of Hormuz while observing the Iranian management protocol of the strait was made possible following requests by the Chinese foreign minister and the country's ambassador to Iran. Facilitation of the passage of Chinese ships was pursued based on the deep relations and the strategic partnership between Tehran and Beijing. And it was decided that a number of Chinese ships requested by the country would transit this waterway after reaching an understanding about the Iranian management protocols of the strait. And this passage began Wednesday night, last night, as Trump is landing in Beijing. Experts believe that this measure, which is based on Iranian internal protocols, will prevent any political exploitation of the strait's capacity to exert external pressure and will strengthen Tehran's position of intelligent management of this vital route. So what happened here? This is pretty easy to interpret, and it's actually quite important. What the Iranians were doing is, first of all, signaling to Beijing not to throw them under the bus. We're still your ally. We're helping you out. Also, easing up pressure in the Strait of Hormuz on Beijing so that when Trump says to Xi, we got to open the Strait of Hormuz, you need the Strait of Hormuz as more than we do, Xi has a card to play and say, hey, well, I'm not really under threat in the Strait of Hormuz. I can get through. You're the one who's blocking me. I can actually get through. The Iranians let me through. So they're trying, that's what the Iranians are trying to do. They're trying to give Xi Jinping a card to play with Trump on the Strait of Hormuz to make it less enticing for him to cooperate with Trump, but also signal to the Chinese that they're still loyal to Xi Jinping and they're easing up on the pressure on him from the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So that's what I see in this. But you put all of this together and don't believe the hype about some rosy, friendly meeting about how Trump and Xi are friends. And you're going to hear all sorts of news about economic partnerships. Sure, the Chinese have no problem doing economic deals with their enemies. They do it all the time with countries that they consider enemies. They make economic partnerships, and there's a lot of of course there's a lot of economic partnership between the U.S. and China. But beneath the surface, again, look at what we've just laid out. This tension on Taiwan. This is the most strident, most aggressive language they've ever used. You have that. You have U.S. sanctions being ramped up just a couple of days ago, this week, in the lead up to this visit, and Trump didn't loosen the sanctions on China as a confidence building measure going into this meeting. He did the opposite. He doubled down. He made stronger sanctions on China's use of Iranian oil and refineries. And then you have Xi Jinping telling Chinese companies to ignore the US sanctions, to violate them. And then you have the Iranians saying, hey, we're good with China. China is, can transit the Strait of Hormuz. So the Iran issue is very much front and center, even though they're not talking about it. And I don't think that tensions between the U.S. and China have been higher in a very long time, despite all of the friendly talk on the surface. That's what I wanted to share with you today. I hope you found this helpful. Please like, subscribe, do all that stuff. Thank you for growing the channel. Please drop a comment. Let me know what you thought of this video. I hope you found it helpful. God bless.